there's evidence that if we try and build our bodies with too much plant fat, with too much phytosterol, which we can do in a pinch, we can do that. But if we do it too much, it can create some issues. One is that it can create rigidity of red blood cells, and red blood cells need to be flexible because if they're not, they can't squeeze through little capillaries like they're supposed to. The main things are sunlight exposure, infrared light. Anything that's going to build charge in your body is going to help build the structured water, and that's going to prevent this clotting response, whether it's in the artery wall or in the bloodstream itself after that happens. Because once you get like that formation of plaque in the artery, it's going to be in here. Now there's something that's interfering with blood flow, and that's going to create like an eddy on this side. It's going to be harder for things to move past there.
Hello and welcome to the channel. I'm Sarah and today's guest is Dr. Stephen Hussey. Stephen is a chiropractor and functional medicine practitioner. He's also a speaker and health coach and the author of several books, including a book on the heart, Understanding the Heart. After having a widowmaker's heart attack at the age of 34, Dr. Hussey became determined to learn everything he could about the heart. First of all, because of unsatisfactory treatment he got in the hospital, but also to make sure he didn't have another heart attack. He also is very passionate about educating others on heart health, and he has a wide range of skills in his toolbox, ranging from quantum biology approaches that involve light, water, grounding, but also sensible and helpful advice on nutrition and the occasional supplement. In this interview, Dr. Hussey dispels lots of myths about heart disease, clots, cholesterol, so-called heart-healthy food. And he also describes how the heart really works and its function in the body. So this leads on nicely from the video I made recently on why the heart isn't the pump. And Dr. Hussey is now going to inform you on what the heart really is. So I thoroughly enjoyed this interview. It's one of the most interesting chats I've had on the channel for a very long time. Welcome to the channel, Dr. Hussey. Do you want to introduce yourself and tell people all about your experience with your heart attack and also what we're going to be talking about today? Because obviously cardiology, the heart, circulation, clots is a really important subject, with cardiovascular disease being the top killer, I think, still in America for certain, but probably globally.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on. Happy to be here. Yeah, first off, what got me interested in this, why have I looked so far into this, and it's my own story. I was very sick as a child and ultimately ended up with type 1 diabetes, which I was told my whole childhood that predisposed me to heart disease. And so I was always interested in the heart, at least somewhat, and got very disillusioned with Western medicine when their recommendations for helping me manage those conditions as a kid didn't work. My dad always inspired this curiosity in me. So as I was learning that these things weren't working, I was just curious about why they weren't working. And that just kind of led me down this path. But yeah, anytime I learned about something about informal education about the heart, my ears perked up and I was like, oh yeah, I'm predisposed to that, supposedly, in that traditional way of thinking in Western medicine. I just kind of learned that the way I lived my life had an ability to change my conditions and get rid of all of them, mostly, for the most part. And then eventually learned that I could basically reduce my risk and get rid of those conditions, I guess, and just found that Western medicine was kind of short in their recommendations for that. And then ultimately, despite my best efforts, I mean, I was doing a lot of like exercise and good diet. That's kind of how I controlled my health for a long time. And was learning about this stuff. But then at the age of 34, which was 4.5 years ago, I had a widowmaker heart attack, despite doing those things, despite, eating a good diet, it's a very subjective term, I guess, for most people, but and exercising. And it wasn't enough. And it kind of pushed me further. Because at first I was pretty demoralized, pretty low point in my life. Like I tried to live healthy and then this still happened. But it was the experience in the hospital that I had and how like experiencing firsthand how bad it is, like the recommendations they were giving, how bad they were, and how like it made me feel like, unfortunately, people are gonna be in that situation too, just like I was, and they're gonna be getting this information, and they're not gonna know what to do, and they're not gonna have the previous knowledge I had, and the ability to go get further knowledge like I have since then. And so I was like, I've got to tell people. I've got to like tell people this information so that they can make a more informed health decision. I can't tell them what to do, but I can give them information that helps them make a better decision. So that's what I've been doing. But, since the time of having the heart attack, which, if we want, we can get into like why I think it happened, which I'll probably never know for sure, but I have lots of different ideas and speculations and things. But having that really pushed me in this direction of looking deeper and like seeing health at a whole new level. And these are lots of things that I was aware of before. Like I was aware of circadian rhythm, I was aware of grounding, I was aware of all this stuff before, but I wasn't really practicing it that like I do now. And then when I started to dig deeper and trying to figure out why this happened, I was like, oh my gosh, this stuff is like a super big deal. And it's probably why I had the heart attack, or what allowed me in the situation that I was in to have the heart attack. Whereas if I've been doing those things, it's likely I wouldn't have had the heart attack in the face of what I was going through. But regardless, it's what the universe gave me. It's what it chose for me, and it's what pushed me in this direction. And honestly, I like to see it now as like the universe equipping me with what I need to do what I'm supposed to do in life, or how I'm supposed to help people. And so, yeah, it was, there's all kinds of details there that I skipped over as far as like what happened in the heart attack and all the whole sequence of events, and what happened since, and what happened to my heart. But I'm happy to say that within 3 months, my heart function returned to normal because there was damage to the tissue in the heart. And the conductive signal wasn't conducting very well through the tissue in the heart. And the ejection fraction of my heart had dropped to 35%, which normal was 50 to 70%. And in 3 months, that fully recovered. And the doctors were like, well, you must be taking your medications. And I was like, well, I actually never took the medications except for a blood thinner because there was a stent in there. I took that for 6 months. But yeah, I fully recovered, and I haven't tested since. So I'm assuming it's doing okay because I feel great. And then I also developed, and this will lead us right into like, talking about like clotting, because that's what everybody like. What is atherosclerosis and clotting and that kind of stuff? Because of the intervention they did during the heart attack to place a stent and quote unquote save my life, if that was what saved my life, I'm not sure. But because of that, they went into the femoral artery in my groin. And when they sealed up the artery after that, the device they used to seal up the artery changed the blood flow dynamics going down my leg, and I developed plaque in my leg, in like the femoral artery in my thigh, which restricted blood flow to my lower leg. So about 3 or 4 months after the heart attack, I started being more active again. Um, and I couldn't walk very fast. I couldn't run. I couldn't play soccer. Couldn't snowboard, anything like that without pain in my lower leg. I didn't know what it was at first. I was trying to figure out, is this like tightness? I mean, just that out of shape because I haven't done anything in a while. I didn't know. But it was quite painful. And so eventually got around to figuring out that it was a 75 to 99% blockage of plaque in my leg. And at the time, they were like, well, let's not do anything about it because, you can't do some of these things you like, but it's not preventing you from doing your day-to-day life. So when we start messing with them, they get worse. So we're just going to leave it and watch it. And I was like, okay. But I continued doing my heart health routine and investigating these things further. And the main things I changed were I got way more sunlight. I grounded a lot more. I set my circadian rhythm, and I took a few select supplements that I only took for about a year. But a year after that initial diagnosis of the blockage, I came back. I went back, and it was only 50% blocked, so it had reduced. And they didn't believe it, so they came back in, did the whole test again. They did a test twice on me, and it showed the same result. And at the time, the vascular surgeon said, well, we can't say it's better because we don't see these things get better. And I was like, okay, well, I mean, the testing shows that this one's better. Like, why aren't you asking questions about this, about potentially what I did? Even if I don't understand what I did that worked, like, let's figure it out together so you can help other people. But there was none of that. And then a year later, I went back and got the test again, and it was normal, completely normal. And then a year after that, I went back and it was still normal. So I reversed 75 to 99% blockage of plaque in my leg, which is interesting because they told me that was impossible. They don't see that, obviously. He said that we don't see these things get better, especially in a type 1 diabetic, because if you look at the literature, type 1s fare worse with peripheral artery disease than even type 2s, which I'm not sure why that is, but they do. So yeah, so it obviously works. And then I've gotten recent testing back in February of my coronary arteries, the arteries in my heart, and they're for the most part clean. There's a mild amount of plaque in the RCA, the right coronary artery, that was there at the time of the heart attack, so that has not progressed, and everything else is clean. And that's with LDL levels well above normal, what they call normal, and it's what I think is mainly a result of this light stuff. So that's kind of my story. It's why I'm so passionate about this and why I've dug deeper than anybody I've met. But I'm willing to meet that person. I want to know if they're out there. But yeah, so that's my story. So we can go into any aspect of that that you want.
Yeah, I think there's lots of things that I'd like to ask. First of all, I think the listeners would be interested in what was the advice that you were given that you think's absolutely terrible, and you touched on what we would call the CAC score. Do you want to maybe briefly go over those two things so that people can be up to speed?
Yeah, so a CAC score is a measure of calcified plaque. So it's basically just looking at calcification and the lining of an artery of the coronary arteries. And my CAC score was a perfect score of 0, 6 months prior to the heart attack. And technically, the literature shows that the higher your CAC score is, the more risk of a heart attack you have, and that I think a 0 score puts me at like a 1.1 to 1.7% risk of having a heart attack. So it's still possible, and obviously I'm part of that 1%. But I was at very low risk according to that test. But that test doesn't show you about soft plaque. It doesn't show you lots of different things. It just measures the calcified plaque, which we'll probably get into like why calcified plaque is there, what's the difference, and does plaque even cause heart attacks? Because I could argue that it doesn't. But yeah, there's that. And then yeah, the advice in the hospital, it was pretty terrible. Like it was, first of all, it was just medication after medication. I think I was prescribed, I can't remember, it was somewhere between 8 and 11 different medications while I was in the hospital. Even just as much as like just a perfect example is like the first night, it was during COVID. I wasn't allowed any visitors or anything like that. So I was pretty upset. I was in a bad place, I guess, and I was stressed it was going to happen again. I just kept feeling things in my heart. Obviously, it had been damaged, and I was like getting pretty anxious and stressed. And they were like, "What do you want, a Xanax?" And I was like, no, I don't think that's going to help, but thanks. And then like the message on the screen in my room would just come up and say, you've been prescribed a new medication. And then like 5 minutes later, someone would walk in and say, okay, here's your medication. And I'm just like, what is this? No one's given me informed consent. No one's told me why we're doing this medication, anything like that. But yeah, there's a lot of different medications, and they told me I'd be on 5 the rest of my life, which were a blood thinner, 2 blood pressure medications, a statin, and a baby aspirin the rest of my life. And again, I took the blood thinner for a different blood thinner than I recommended, but I took a blood thinner for 6 months because there was a stent in there. So anyways, there was that information. There was also someone came in to counsel me on diet, and they literally told me to eat a processed food diet. Things that were, I mean, there was healthy foods on there too. Like there was some whole foods, but it was like avoid the saturated fat, only eat lean meats. And then it was foods that I was allowed to eat that were okay were animal crackers, fig Newtons, and foods full of vegetable oils and things like that. And I was just like, okay. And it was just like a nurse coming in doing her job. She's been trained. This is what she tells people to eat, and she does that. That kind of stuff. Yeah, it was this message of like, if you don't take your medications, then you're gonna develop heart failure. If you don't take your medications, you're gonna have another heart attack. If you don't eat this way, it was like the end all be all. Like this was the thing. And they were wanting me on blood thinners and stuff, obviously. And I asked them about magnesium as a blood thinner, which I knew could thin the blood, so to speak, from a biochemical perspective. Which there's biophysics ways to do that as well. But I asked them about magnesium, and they were like, "Magnesium is not a blood thinner." And I was like, oh, well, I can show you some literature that suggests that it is a blood thinner. But it was just like the shutdown of conversation. Anything they didn't understand, or it wasn't, I was taking up too much of their time or whatever. And there was an aspect too, is like a teaching hospital. There was interns and students in there doing rounds with people. So the resident or the attending doesn't want to appear stupid. So that was probably frustrating to them that I was asking challenging questions. So I get that, whatever. But it doesn't excuse like the whole dismissal of conversation. And even like the last attending that came in and saw me before I was discharged literally said I'd never seen him before. It was the first time I saw this doctor. He was like, "Well, I'm not going to talk to you about medications because you've made it clear in your chart, or they made it clear in your chart you're not going to take them." And I was just like, "Okay," but like it was just I was branded as that, and everybody saw that in my chart, and then that's what I was. I was an uncompliant patient, and they didn't want to give me the time of day. They didn't. He wasn't curious as to why or whatever. He's just like, "All right, well, we'll get you out of here. We got nothing for you," and which I was happy with because I couldn't wait to get out of there.
Okay, that's very interesting. And shall we move into what actually does cause clots or plaques, and what's all of the current mainstream thinking, and what would you say is more towards the truth?
Yeah. So like the mainstream thinking is, and this has been this way since Ansel Keys in the 50s, because heart disease was becoming a new thing. So first of all, it doesn't make sense to me that we're blaming this new, quote unquote, new disease that really only skyrocketed in the 40s and 50s on something that's been around forever, ever since life has been on this planet or mammals have been on this planet, and that is cholesterol. They'll say that it's just an accumulation of cholesterol or LDL. They want to track your LDL levels, which is what carries cholesterol around among other things in your body. So they'll blame that. They'll say that it gets stuck on the lining of the artery, kind of like, hot wax in a cold pipe, just kind of gets clotted in there. And that's completely, outdated by literature. It's just kind of this old idea. And there's really no evidence to suggest that. The only evidence that does suggest that is very poor quality associational research, where they look at the amounts of LDL and they try and say it associates with higher amounts of plaque. But there's no mechanism of cause. They can't identify any other factor in those studies. They're just the worst type of research. You can't really draw conclusions on that at all. But there's just as much associational research that shows the opposite. So what do we believe? None of it, because none of it really can be used to draw conclusions from, concrete conclusions anyways. So anyways, when you do look at, like when you analyze what plaque is in an artery, it's clotting tissue. It's made up of the same type of tissue that if I cut my skin, the body forms a clot and a scab that stops bleeding. So it's a response to injury somewhat, but the blood can clot even without injury. If it gets stagnant or it doesn't move as well, then it can develop a clot. It can clump together and have this clotting response. And so, there's studies that say that when you look at plaque, it's like 87% clotting tissue, plus or minus 8%, depending on which cadaver they were looking at. And I've had pathologists that do autopsies reach out to me and say the same thing. It's like, yep, when we dissect plaque in arteries, it's clotting tissue. We're just peeling away layers of clotting tissue is what we're doing when we look at it. And so there's very little cholesterol present. There is some, if you analyze it molecularly, there's some, but it's no more than enough that would just get like caught up in a clot if a clot formed, and there happens to be some LDL and some cholesterol there, so it gets caught up. And so the other thing about plaque is that people think, like if I have like the middle of an artery like this, people think that plaque forms on the inside of the artery like that, and that's not where it forms, at least initially. Initially, it forms like inside the artery wall. So it's not on the inner lining of the artery, it's inside the artery wall itself. And there's these different layers of the artery wall, different muscle layers. And it forms in the tunica intima layer, which is, so like if my hands were like made up the artery wall, it forms on the inside of it. So the plaque starts to form and it expands the artery wall both ways. So it's not like it's just growing on the inside of one of the artery walls, it's making the wall expand. And so that does lead to some encroachment of the blood flow in the lumen of the artery, but it forms in the artery wall. So the question is like, how does it end up in the artery wall, this blood that the clot's in there? So what happens is when like the walls of the artery themselves, they don't get their blood supply from the blood moving through the artery. They get their blood supply from the arteries that supply the artery wall with blood, which are called the vasa vasorum. And whenever we get like there's a lining of cells called the endothelia that line the artery, and when those cells get a signal to grow or proliferate, then those cells need a blood supply, just like all cells need a blood supply. And when they start to grow into the lining of the artery or expand into the lining of the artery, they need a blood supply. And so the blood supply that comes from the vasa vasorum, those arteries start to grow in to like deeper into the artery wall to supply those new cells with blood. But when new arteries grow, they are incomplete, like they're fenestrated, they have holes in them, kind of like you're in the process of building a house, but the windows aren't in and the doors aren't in yet. So there's these holes in it, and that can leak blood, and it leaks blood right into the intimal layer, which is where the plaque starts. And this is more likely to happen if we are insulin resistant or diabetic, because when that happens, like insulin is what signals for like growth and repair and like those new vessels to form. So if we're insulin resistant, those vessels don't even form as well, so they're more leaky for longer. And that's why being diabetic or type insulin resistant is like the number one risk factor for development of plaque. Because when that blood leaks out into this artery wall, it's not in a tube anymore. So it's not flowing in a tube, and it becomes stagnant, and stagnant blood clots. And so we get this clotting material that forms in the middle of the artery wall like this, and it expands it. And the more that it tries to, grow those vessels, the more that it expands. And so that's what initially causes that process. And so the question is, well, what causes the cells on the lining of the artery, the endothelia, to proliferate, to grow? What causes them to multiply like that? And from what I found, it's two different things. One, it could be direct damage to the lining of the artery, which can happen if we have lack of structured water on the lining of the artery, which is what protects the artery. And then we get toxin exposures and different things, endotoxins and heavy metals and various things that can then damage the lining of the artery. And the response to those cells from being damaged is a proliferative response, so they grow. It could also be low cell voltage of those cells that, we can get in a conversation about cancer and what cancer is. And when the cells have low voltage, they multiply. So that could be something there, like the cells could start to multiply incorrectly because of the voltage, they're having trouble maintaining their voltage, but also poor blood flow. Well, there seems to be like this Goldilocks amount of blood flow, according to certain researchers. Whereas the blood is moving too fast or moving too slow, it can't maintain the lateral pressure on the artery wall, and it needs to maintain a certain amount of pressure. So if there's not enough pressure because it's either sludgy blood moving slow or it's blood moving way too fast, then the lateral pressure doesn't happen. So the endothelial cell starts to grow in a little bit to create the pressure. But if they proliferate in too much, then the process happens in the artery wall with the vasa vasorum, and we can get more plaque development. But blood flow, I mean, the Goldilocks amount of blood flow, in my opinion, is created by structured water formation on the lining of the artery. So structured water protects the lining of the artery, keeps blood moving adequately. It also keeps blood thin and prevents a clotting response in the arteries itself. And so when you understand that, and then you understand the main thing that builds structured water is infrared light, I could make an argument that the biggest issue with atherosclerosis is a lack of sunlight, a lack of infrared light exposure, which is what's happened in humanity. We've created indoor living where we're not getting the infrared light that we need, and then for our arteries can't stay healthy. But that's my explanation of plaque, and whether or not plaque causes heart attacks, it's another conversation.
Yes. Do you want to speak a little bit more about the structured water and the near infrared light? And also, I think this idea of charge, cells not having enough charge, is something people are not aware of. And again, people may have heard the word voltage or membrane potential. And I think this is a really important area as well.
Yeah. So, so structured water is basically an energy storage vessel, I guess, energy storage vessel for the body. And so if we do things that, put our bodies in environments where it can allow it to gain energy, it's going to build structured water because we need to store the energy. And the way it does that is build structured water, create structured water. So what is structured water? It's more like a gel. Your listeners are probably familiar with it, but it's like this fourth phase of water where there's this gel-like state of water, which is most of the water in our bodies is in this gel state, which is why I feel like a gel. You could poke me and I bounce right back. And at least most of the water in our cells is supposed to be in this gel-like state. And so that matters from a sense of maintaining your cellular voltage, because when we talk about structured water forming, it's forming because it's gaining electrons energy from the environment. And so they're stored in the structured water. So it becomes a very electronegatively charged substance, which what we are, that we're supposed to have this net negative voltage. And anybody who studies cellular physiology and action potentials, they know about this net negative voltage that we have. Um, and, they'll say it's because of other things, but it's really because of the amount of structured water in there. And so the first way this is relevant is that if those cells can't maintain enough structured water, they can't maintain their voltage. And part of normal physiology is to have what we call, like what physiologists call action potentials, which is a drop in voltage, a controlled drop in voltage of a cell to have something happen, some physiology happen, and then it returns to this normal voltage. And that's a controlled situation where it can do that. However, if the cells get into a state where they're pathologic, which is mainly driven by poor mitochondrial function, then it can't maintain this voltage because it can't maintain unfolded proteins, which means there's no surface area for structured water to form, which means there's a drop in voltage. And if that gets below a certain voltage, then we can get this proliferative response. We get this, like one of the things that a drop in voltage could signal would be cell division. Um, and so if it gets below that, this lower voltage, and there's studies that show that cancer, like this uncontrolled cell division, is like cancer cells have this low voltage. That's one of their characteristics. And so if it drops below that and it can't return to that normal voltage, then we can get this proliferative uncontrolled cell division. And so that's one thing that could create an endothelial cell lacking its voltage can be creating an endothelial cell that becomes dividing too much, creating this proliferative response, and then the whole process I just talked about with the arteries happens. So that's one thing that could happen, which concerns structured water because it's maintaining the structured water in the cells itself. But then there's also areas of liquid water in the body. There's lots of areas of liquid water. There's extracellular fluid and things like that. But then there's also lymphatic fluid, and there's cerebrospinal fluid, and there's the blood, which have some liquid water in them. And that liquid water, when it gets next to water-loving surfaces, can form this gel-like structured form of water. And Dr. Pollock has shown this in his lab. And there's many scientists that have shown this, and they call it like a cell-free layer on the lining of the arteries. And it's a layer that no red blood cells or anything can really get to between the artery wall and the fluid of the blood, or the plasma of the blood. And so there's this layer of structured water on the artery wall. And this structured water has different characteristics. One of them is that they call it exclusion zone water because it excludes anything that's not it, which is why it's a cell-free layer, because nothing can penetrate it. So it provides protection to the lining of the artery, protection from things that may damage it and then cause this proliferative response. It's also been shown that because of the way structured water forms and the charge separation it creates, because structured water is very electronegatively charged, and it creates a very positively charged fluid in the blood because of the hydrogens that are cleaved off, that creates a battery situation where there's energy, and this energy does the work of moving fluid. And they've shown this in Dr. Pollock's lab too, in animal models, that they can stop the heart from contracting, and they can still move fluid by applying infrared light and building structured water and making the blood flow. They increase blood flow up to 300% in animal models. So that keeps blood moving, preventing a clotting response. And also when you keep blood moving at this, I'd say Goldilocks type flow, it maintains the lateral pressure on the artery wall, which allows it to not have that proliferative response. And then, so those are the ways that I think structured water is super important as far as preventing plaque in the first place. But then even if plaque develops, we want to prevent like an acute clotting response in the blood, which has nothing to do with any of that stuff. It's just when blood gets stagnant or dehydrated or sludgy or whatever, it's more likely to clot. And it's less likely to do that if the red blood cells and elements of blood, the platelets and the lipoproteins and everything are evenly spaced and hold their charge and are moving through at an adequate pace, and everything's just like hooked up like train cars moving together. And that is created by what's called zeta potential on lipoproteins and red blood cells and anything in the blood. And that zeta potential is created by structured water. That's what gives them the negative charge that they have around them. And so when two things have two like charges, we know that like charges repel each other. Why you can't put the two negative ends of a magnet together? They don't like it. So they stay evenly spaced and not clumped together. And so those types, that's how structured water is relevant to all this vascular type health. And again, you zoom out 10,000-foot view and you see that humans have removed the things that build structured water. They've added a bunch of things that interfere with structured water and insult the lining of the artery. And we've also interfered with the body's ability to repair those things by disrupting our circadian rhythm and having an epidemic of type 2 diabetes. Like that's the recipe for why we have this plaque in the arteries.
So, what would you say? People are familiar with Dr. Pollock's work because he actually came on the channel to talk about his paper that you're referring to, that the blood can move itself in the absence of a heartbeat in the presence of infrared light. So, what things would you say that prevents the process you've just described from happening?
Um, the main things are sunlight exposure, infrared light. Anything that's going to build charge in your body is going to help build the structured water. And that's going to prevent this clotting response, whether it's in the artery wall or in the bloodstream itself after that happens. Because once you get like that formation of plaque in the artery, it's going to be in here. Now there's something that's interfering with blood flow, and that's going to create like an eddy on this side. It's going to be harder for things to move past there, um, like they should be, and not have a clotting response. So infrared light and grounding, even proper metabolism. But proper metabolism and mitochondrial health, I think, is more like cellular hydration, cellular structured water we're building there. Whereas drinking enough water and electrolytes with that water, and then infrared light and grounding are things that are going to build it more in the vascular system, from my perspective. And then we also want to remove the things that are interfering with structured water formation. And so that means mainly toxin exposures. So anything that we say is inflammatory, or that medicine says is inflammatory, or that it's an oxidative molecule, it creates oxidative stress. What we really mean by that is that we're destroying the body's charge. We're taking away structured water. So if we're in an inflammatory state, or have high oxidative stress, then things that do that will destroy structured water. So that could be all the various toxins. I mean, everything like artificial fragrances, heavy metals, plastics, all the stuff. It's all these things that interfere with charge, or just get in there and interfere with normal physiology, or like hydrophilic surfaces for structured water to form on. So all those things, and then wireless signals, definitely. So it kind of makes sense to me. Like if I explain it at that level, like the things that build our charge are the things that humans and all life are in contact with every single day. And the modern things that we've added, the things that are not natural, the non-native electromagnetic fields, everything that's not on the electromagnetic spectrum of light from the sun is probably, or from the earth, the streaming resonance of the earth, is probably going to steal our charge because it's not native to us. And that's what we find. That's what it does. So, I mean, there's studies. There's a study that Dr. Pollock says that hasn't been published, but it was a Wi-Fi router broke down structured water, and I think it broke down like 20% or something like that. And then there's another study that I found the other day, I posted a few weeks ago, where they put a smartphone back up to the back of someone's knee, and they started to immediately see the low formation of red blood cells in the artery, which means that they would lost their zeta potential, they lost structured water, and they were sticking together too much. And they took the cell phone away from it, and things went back to normal. So these wireless signals, or something about that device, whether it was a wireless signal or not, is breaking down structured water. So removing those things is super important. And then in the face of, like, those things are important for preventing it. And then even if you have like a ton of plaque in your arteries or whatever, like I know people with like CAC scores of 3,000 that have never had heart disease symptoms and never had a heart attack. So it's not like that thing's a death sentence or whatever. It's about making those things irrelevant, and putting your body in a situation where blood keeps moving despite those things and builds collateral arteries and that kind of stuff. But one of the best things for that is setting your circadian rhythm, because you need to optimize your melatonin levels. Melatonin has been shown to be very healing to the lining of the artery. It's been shown to stabilize rupture-prone plaques, which I don't think cause heart attacks, but they do lead to more plaque development when a plaque ruptures, those types of things. But also when we talk about like those cells that maybe potentially lose their voltage, We need to get into like states of deep healing, like when we sleep, to have mitophagy and autophagy, so that those cells that have become damaged can get killed off and we can make new healthy ones, which is why this deep healing sleep is so associated with higher levels of artery health and artery healing. So we need that deep sleep. So we need to set our circadian rhythm by being very conscious of our light environments before sunrise and after sunset and things like that. I think that, again, the damage and stuff can happen, but it's even worse if you interfere with your body's ability to heal from it. And that's from anything. That's from physical trauma, emotional trauma, toxin exposures, all the different damage that can happen in life and things that we can't avoid. Like, we have to be able to heal from it. And if you can't do that, then you're setting yourself behind the eight ball. But those are probably some of the most critical things I'd say to do for artery health. And I want people to notice that I said nothing about knowing what your LDL levels are.
Yeah, because you touched on an important point that the red blood cells are like loners. They like to be on their own, away from the other red blood cells, and that everything in the blood has to sort of float along like very organized boats. So do you want to talk a little bit maybe about things people are familiar with, like labs, because there are sort of sets of markers which could be deemed a cardiovascular risk, and then tie it in with the different kinds of clots, because people like Malcolm McKendrick and Paul Mason have talked about different kinds of clots, and then maybe talk about why there's still misleading information in lipid panels, because we're not actually looking at the blood that's alive and floating with all the lipids and things floating along. The blood's been processed in a lab, and what things could people look at in their own lifestyle or labs to maybe prompt them to make changes. I want to thank my sponsor, Lightwater Scientific, who helped me deliver free, valuable information to you and also allow me to have great guests on this channel. Lightwater Scientific produce the purest and most deuterium-depleted water in the world. Depleting or lowering your deuterium has numerous health benefits, from better metabolic health, more energy, greater resilience, less brain fog, increased physical performance, enhanced healing, and healthier mitochondria. Deuterium is an isotope of hydrogen, also known as heavy water, because it's bigger and heavier than regular hydrogen. Even though deuterium makes up only 0.02% of hydrogen, it's found everywhere. Deuterium is a burden to your body because it interferes with the intricate chemical reactions that occur by slowing them down. Deuterium is kryptonite to your mitochondria, and we need healthy mitochondria to produce energy. There's over 60 years of scientific research on the negative effects of too much deuterium on health, and also the positive benefits of lowering deuterium in the body. Lightwater deuterium-depleted water is 100% safe and non-toxic. In fact, it's the closest in structure to the metabolic water that your mitochondria produce. Lightwater deuterium-depleted water comes in 5 or 10 parts per million glass or plastic bottles, so level up your health by leveling down your deuterium today. The purchase link is in the show notes, and use code Dr. Sarah for a discount off your order.
Yeah. Yeah, and the whole lab work thing, just like you're alluding to, it's crazy. Like, it's one snapshot in time, it's one tissue of the body, and it's been taken out of its host. And so we have no idea if it's the same thing that's in you right now. It's completely different. And like the energetics of it are completely different. Like, maybe some of the biochemistry that's there, like you could analyze it in certain ways and say, yeah, that's what it is right now. But that biochemistry and the biophysics of the blood is going to change when you walk out of that lab and go sit in the sun. Like, it's going to completely change like that. So whatever your levels were of whatever they're measuring, they were that, and they're not that anymore. And I say that because as I talk about these numbers and stuff, I want people to understand that what's way more important than any number on a test is the environment you put your body in, day in and day out. That's what truly determines risk. I don't care what the number says. I mean, like, I'm a perfect example. I had a CEC score of 0. It told me I was at very low risk. It still happened because the environment my body's in was bad for about 3 straight days, and it caused a situation that caused a clot or a stress response that caused a heart attack. So the environment is way, way more important. However, like, in medicine, they'll tell you that it's the LDL. Like, that's the main thing. They take this standard lipid panel, they take the total cholesterol, the LDL, the HDL, the triglycerides, and some ratios and things, and they'll say this is what, or for a long time they've said this is what tells you your risk of heart disease. And now, I think the studies are coming out that, like, that's not what's going to assess risk, obviously. And so now they're trying to, like, microanalyze everything, overanalyze. They're trying to break it up into all these subfractions. They're looking at ApoB and ApoA1, and they're looking at oxidized LDL and small dense particles and all the different particle numbers and particle sizes and all this stuff. And to me, it's just a wild goose chase. We're just trying to overanalyze these things and make our lipids what they should be, and it's not preventing heart disease because it's not addressing the environment of someone's body. And so what's more important, I would say, or more useful is, I mean, from a blood work perspective, is looking at your state of inflammation. That could be useful. Again, if you're having like a sickness or an illness, like a flu or something like that, then your inflammation should be high. Your body's fighting something, and it's basically that's probably a signal of why it's fighting something because there's inflammation. So like that's very transient too. So you can get a high sensitivity C-reactive protein level that's a measure of general inflammation in the body, and that could be high. But again, that doesn't determine your risk. What determines your risk is what you do after that. Like, so if it was really, really bad, or if it was really good, what will make it good if it's bad and what will keep it good if it's good is what you do from that point on. And that means go put your body in environments that create like gain electrons to your system. And so that means infrared light and grounding and all that kind of stuff. You could also look at things like lots of various measures of like clotting. So you could look at prothrombin and thrombin time. You could look at all kinds of things like platelets and that kind of stuff. But again, those are transient. Those are like one snapshot in time. You're looking at what they were at that moment. And if those things are elevated, then if your body does get a signal to have a clot, it's more likely to happen if those things are not where they should be. Or you could get a erythrocyte sedimentation rate, an ESR level, which is a measure of how readily your red blood cells clump together. And we don't want it to clump together that much or that quickly. We don't want that. That means the zeta potential is low. But again, that's one snapshot in time. That's what it was. So that number would completely change, if that blood was still in you, but also B is what environment your body's in. Like, are you grounded right now? Are you in infrared light? Those types of things are going to influence where that is. So that's way more important. And then, you can there's some testing that can be useful, like as far as like metabolic health, like if your leptin or insulin levels are too high, like those are things like if you're fasted, like those things should never be high. So regardless of what state your body's in, like they should never be that elevated. So that could be an indication that your metabolic health is going awry, and that's going to interfere with your body's ability to heal a clotting response if it happens. So that can be useful. But again, the test doesn't determine the risk. It's what you do from the test and how you correct your metabolic health, which would be set your circadian rhythm and eat a whole foods diet. And time your eating properly. Like those are way more important for metabolic health. So yeah, those are kind of a snapshot of some of the numbers that people will look at. But the more and more I talk to people, like clients I work with, the more and more like I see them put their blood work down and they're like, okay, so what should I do? Because it's not about making that blood work look the way it's supposed to look. It's about making your environment look the way it's supposed to look.
Yeah, that's something I struggle with clients in the beginning. They want me to read their lab work or their HTMA, and I say I can't do it without a lifestyle questionnaire because all of your labs and your HTMA and everything is a function of what you do in your life, and I can't draw any conclusions just from some numbers without knowing how the numbers got like that in the first place. And just before we move into what the function of the heart really is, because I made a video about how it's not a pump, but I left it to you to explain what it actually is. I touched on certain things about vortexing, and there's a lot more. A lot of people get very confused about food and what's good and bad for the heart. Of course, fat's been demonized and people are told not to eat red meat. And then there are sort of so-called heart healthy oils. And then I know there's like three questions all piled up together. I know that being a type 1 diabetic, you probably would have been given really bad advice on how to control your own blood sugar. And they'd say, oh, it doesn't matter, your HbA1c's at like 7 or 8%. And don't worry if your blood sugar's 150, as long as you don't have a hypo. So I think what I'm sort of going towards now is just we'll move out of all the biochemistry into more of the physics. But maybe if you could give insights into food, and information that people have been given that's wrong, and then finish off of why you thought you had a heart attack. Because I think you said you were playing squash when it happened. Not that squash causes heart attacks, but I think it would complete the story for the listeners.
Yeah. So, um, first, like true functions of the heart are to vortex blood. That's the number one. And there's many ways that the heart vortexes blood as it moves through the heart, because the vascular system is a bunch of tubes, and there's linear movement of blood through that, so it doesn't get vortexed. So we need something that would create that, what nature does to water. And when you vortex the blood, it becomes structured water more readily when it gets out into the periphery, and that's why it does that. That's why we need that. Second, it actually slows the flow of blood. So because if it didn't slow the flow of blood, then whenever we exercised, the tissue demand for the blood would be so high on the arterial side that it would all rush over to the arterial side to go to the tissues, and the venous side would collapse. And then we can't maintain pressure between the two systems, and we would die. So it's actually there to slow the flow of blood. And there's very eloquent studies done on endurance athletes that show that the heart gets hypertrophied in endurance athletes because it's more effective at slowing the flow of blood during exertion. And the third is that the heart has a giant electromagnetic field. And the reason it has that, in my opinion, is because it's so dense in mitochondria, which create electromagnetic fields. And when you concentrate those electromagnetic fields in there, it will create a bigger one. However, the brain and the eyes also have similar amounts of mitochondria. So why is the heart so much bigger? Because the heart is vortexing. The heart is spiraling as it contracts. And I found evidence that shows that when you vortex something in an electromagnetic field, it amplifies the field. But I've also found things that say that an electromagnetic field creates a spiral or a torsion. So it's like chicken or the egg. I don't know. It's like this intricate relationship, and I don't know. They're both just reliant. They're coupled together, which is really important. And what I really want to see, which I've been looking for and I haven't found anywhere, is like someone with heart failure when the heart is expanded and it's more contracting like this rather than vortexing. Is the electromagnetic field of that one person's heart, is their electromagnetic field smaller? Which would be very interesting. Anyways, those are the three functions of the heart, not to forcefully move blood. But then food. So yeah, red meat and saturated fat have been demonized. And I hope what people get from when I talk about the heart and heart disease and plaque and heart attacks is like that I don't often talk about those things with my explanations of why it happens, because I don't think that they're really that relevant. Obviously, food is important, and you should eat a whole foods diet and stick to what I think nature gave us, which means saturated fat, red meat are on the menu for sure. I'd say should be one of the biggest parts of the menu. But yeah, it's been demonized, and it's because of the poor science that Ansel Keys did. He basically did this work where he looked at the amounts of saturated fat and cholesterol in people's diets, and he tried to associate that with heart disease, and he cherry picked the data too. So even if it was a good quality form of research, which associational research is something you can't draw conclusions from, he cherry picked the data. And so if you take all the data available at the time, there was nothing to support that. But the other aspect of it is that I like to think of it as plant fat versus animal fat. And I'm not demonizing plant fat here, but we are animals. We use animal fat. We use cholesterol. And plants use phytosterol. And if there's evidence that if we try and build our bodies with too much plant fat, with too much phytosterol, which we can do in a pinch, we can do that. But if we do it too much, it can create some issues. One is that it can create rigidity of red blood cells, and red blood cells need to be flexible, because if they're not, they can't squeeze through little capillaries like they're supposed to. And there's some animal model studies that show that when they fed rats higher amounts of phytosterol, meaning like in one study they fed them olive oil and they fed them vegetable oils in one group, and they were way more prone to stroke, because when the blood cells trying to squeeze through the capillaries, they would break and cause damage and stuff. So you can take that study for what it is. It's done in genetically modified rats, but it's interesting. And they also found that surveys of people who ate more plant fats when they did heart valve surgeries on these people, there was more plant fat distributed around the heart valves, which suggests that if there's too much plant fat around, the body can't use it as well. So animal fat's just more important. So I like to think of it that way rather than saturated versus unsaturated or omega-3 versus omega-6, which I think are important distinctions as well. Plant fat versus animal fat is a good way of looking at it. And then the other thing is that when it comes to red meat, like if you look at the creatine, the carnosine, the carnitine, the taurine that are all present in red meat, and you look at the studies showing how beneficial those things are for various aspects of our cardiovascular system, it makes no sense that, okay, we have all these molecules that are so beneficial for the heart, but it's also killing us. That's just illogical. And I think that logic trumps science sometimes, which people might not like that I say that, but I think we've gotten way too down this rabbit hole of peer-reviewed clinical trials and all this kind of stuff, and it kind of makes us it kind of gets that we get lost in that literature a little bit. But it doesn't make sense that, I mean, carnosine has been shown to help repair heart cells when they become damaged. So, like after mine, I had heart cell damage, and you're not going to repair that, or you're not going to make new cells. You have to repair those cells because the heart cells can't divide. So carnitine was on the menu for me, you know. And taurine is one of the best molecules, which is found in high amounts in red meat, especially pork, that is incredible for healing the lining of the artery and creating nitric oxide. Everybody talks about beets and all this stuff when taurine is great for that. So it doesn't make sense that all those molecules are there and, you know, and that it's also bad for us. That's just illogical. So, yeah. And then, you know, as a type 1, and low carb was a game changer for me because it makes it very easy to control blood sugars. When I take away this thing that influences, you know, your blood glucose levels, it makes it easier to predict what's going to happen because even then it's hard to predict because there's so many different things that can affect blood sugar. I could just work out or I could just wake up in the morning and blood sugar is going to rise. So it's like, you know, but eating this thing that doesn't cause this extra thing I have to count for makes it a lot easier to just maintain blood sugar levels. However, I have found some things that show that I don't think there's a threshold. They didn't have a threshold of this, but like elevated blood sugars that are stable are not really that damaging to the blood vessels. They could lead to higher amounts of glycation in various things, like in the red blood cells and in various tissues and stuff long term, but it's the fluctuations. It's the up and down all day long. That's what's damaging to the lining of the artery and creates that proliferative response of the endothelial cells. So that's what you really want to avoid. Like if you're type 1 or if you're just trying to control blood sugars in general, it's the up and down all day long, which, you know, a healthy glucose response is, you know, you get this spike if you have glucose or carbohydrate and it should come down within 2 hours and that's normal. That's healthy depending on how high it spiked. But yeah, so I think that answered all the questions.
Yes, yes, it did. And then I think the last part, if you want, is there anything else you wanted to say about the physics of the heart, like the vortexing? Because I think there's a lot more we could say about the vortex, because there's some schools of thought that say that a vortex can make gravity, which then can make voltage, and you emphasize so much how important voltage and charge is. Or also maybe a bit more about the electrical side of the heart and electronic devices, because obviously we use our phones here.
Mm,
And yes, I know we'll save the why you think you had a heart attack to the end, and also why more men than women have heart attacks. But I think we just
mm.
maybe wrap up on the physics side, because I thought what you just said about the plant cholesterol was absolutely fascinating. So any more insights you've got, that would be fantastic.
Yeah. So the vortexing is super key. I mean, there's a reason that the heart is one big band of muscle that's kind of wrapped up on itself, so that when that conduction signal from the brain that signals that electrical impulse through it comes around and it spirals like that as it goes through it. So that creates this spinning of it. So that's one way that the vortex happens, is the spinning, but also just having the blood interrupted in its flow through these tubes is going to vortex things. So like there's studies that show that when the heart flows into the ventricles, that it flows like kind of like when you drop a quarter in that thing and it goes around like this. That's it. It flows in like that, and it does that. And then also when it goes through the valves, like when it leaves the heart, it eddies on either side. And Da Vinci actually described that originally, or at least it's the first documented case of describing those types of things. And the way he figured that out was fascinating if you read that. He was a genius. But anyways, so there's always ways that it interrupts the blood flow to create this vortexing. And the vortexing is one way that we energize the blood. Energize means make it more coherent, make the water molecules interact with each other more rather than stagnant individual type things. That's more coherence to them, which makes it more likely that they will form structured water when they get next to the lining of the artery later on. So yeah, and that's super important. But then the other aspect of that is because of this vortexing that it's doing, it's amplifying this electromagnetic field, which is why the heart has the biggest electromagnetic field of any organ. And I think it's why it's the main when you hear humans talk, it's the main organ which we talk about when we talk about reaching out into our environment and connecting with others or certain emotional responses. We assign emotions to different organs. Like we say we have gut feelings about things and that kind of stuff, but we say I love you with all my heart. We feel things in our heart. My heart hurts, that kind of thing. And I think it's because it's that field that's allowing us to reach out into our environment, not just connect with other human beings, but all other life. But I think that also makes it more vulnerable to the non-native electromagnetic fields that we're surrounded with these days. And so there's actually some studies that I found where they use harmonizing frequencies like PEMF devices to treat heart failure, which is why I would really like to see if the electromagnetic field of the heart is smaller in heart failure because it's not vortexing. But so, like for me, if the heart's failing or if the blood's not flowing, which is what heart failure is, like one characteristic of heart failure, we'd want to get into environments that create compatible electromagnetic fields and radio frequencies and things like that, which is the sun and the earth. We need contact with those things, basically nature, to create that response. We also need to create mitochondrial health. Like all that stuff is super, super important because without mitochondrial health in the heart, you're not getting the field that you need. And yeah, I mean, but it all makes so much sense in my head at this point. Like we've removed all those things and we've added all this stuff that in the face of a trauma or something that happens, or I had this one client who had chemotherapy because she had Ewing sarcoma as a kid, and that chemotherapy damaged some of the tissue in her heart, and she developed heart failure because of it. But I always ask myself, would she have if we didn't create these environments that just push that along further with all these non-native electromagnetic fields and radio frequencies and things? It's just interesting to think about, and when you learn about the physics that way, you realize that this is not biochemical. There's so much more at a quantum biophysics level that we have to understand, especially with the heart, because it seems to be the organ that's holding this field that is measuring coherence in the body. And so that coherence is then whether or not the heart is picking up coherent or incoherent signals. That information is relayed to the brain neurologically and electromagnetically. And the brain is just the messenger system. It picks up that signal and it relays that information back down to the rest of the body via the nervous system and various other ways of communication. And that's what dictates like the stress state of your body. People talk about autonomic nervous system and that sort of stuff. Like that is measured via the heart. And so if your heart is not functioning, doesn't have the field it's supposed to, or is picking up the wrong signals, then that's going to affect the autonomic nervous system. So you want to change that, you change your environment. So when you think about it that way, it shows you the path to why we're sick and also how to get well.
Yeah, because I was going to ask you about what you think the biofield's for, and it can be as esoteric as you want, because in some ways our aura is just a cloud of charge or plasma, and then some people say that when we do whatever you want to call it, manifesting or remote viewing, that it's not actually the brain that we project out from, it's the heart. And then you mentioned the immune system, and that's really interesting because I think there is actually a link between the heart rate variability levels and how good, all the body's defense is for those who want to look
Mm.
at things in a different way. So what do you think the biofield of the body is for?
I think it's a communication system. It's measuring coherence. So when I say coherence, I mean like how what kind of like communication signals are we receiving? So that could be internal coherence. How well is your body communicating to itself, which could be interfered with scar tissue in the body, with stored trauma in the body, with poor mitochondrial function, high, oxidative stress, so to speak, low body charge. Like all those things can interfere with how well the cells are synced up and communicating to each other. And the heart is the only electromagnetic field that's big enough to monitor that in every cell in the body. And so how well the body's communicating with itself will give the heart a coherent or incoherent signal. But then also externally, the signals we're surrounded with externally can also send us a coherent or incoherent signal. So that could be a relationship, whether it's a loving, positive relationship or a toxic relationship. It could be wireless signals. It could be artificial light. It could be natural light. So what are we communicating to our body that our environment outside of us is? Is it a stressful one that we need to be on alert for, or a non-stressful one? Um, and and so that's picked up via this electromagnetic field of the heart, as long as it's big enough and healthy enough to pick those things up. And so that's signaling, again, that information is received in our heart, and then that's reflected in heart rate variability. It's this coherence, what we're receiving. So again, if we want to affect our heart rate variability, then it's not something that like, I mean, yes, breath work and like meditation, all that stuff will be helpful in certain ways, but we really need to change the environment, internal and external, and that kind of stuff. That's how we change heart rate variability. And then people think heart rate variability is measuring autonomic balance, like your sympathetic and parasympathetic balance. And kind of it is, but really it's measuring coherence, and whether or not we're coherent or not is sent to the brain, and then your brain, based on that, is what's sending a more balanced or unbalanced autonomic nervous system signaling to the body. So again, if we want to change that signaling, which part of that signaling comes back to the heart, we want to change the environment. So this is really relevant with like arrhythmias and things like that. If the heart's getting a signal to like really contract like in these irregular beats, or really fast or too fast, or it goes into these arrhythmias or whatever. I mean, there's stuff developmentally that concerns that too. But the main way we change that stuff is we change our external and internal environments, our communication. What is the heart picking up? Because even though the brain's what's sending that signal down, it's getting that signal from the heart to send back down. So yeah, that's to me what the heart is, that signal is for. It's basically our feelers. It's like our antenna, you know, reaching out into our environment.
Okay, and then because we've like covered so many different topics, why do you think you had a heart attack, and what do you think
Mm.
your chances of having another one are?
Um, I'll confidently say zero. But that's, who knows, but I'm just living life. And, ultimately when I work with clients, that's where I'm not trying to help like heal their heart. Lots of times I'm trying to help heal their thinking, because they've been through the similar thing. How do I get them to the state where I can say that and be like, I'm doing the best I can, and that's as the best that I can do, and I'm decreasing my risk based on all that I've learned based on my lifestyle now. And that's what gives me the confidence. But what gave me the confidence was learning all this stuff. When I learn it and conceptualize it, that's my truth, and that's personal to me. And if I can share that with others, that's great. Um, so, so I'll confidently say zero. But then what caused it in the first place? So, um, I'll preface it by saying I'll likely never know for sure, but there are two mechanisms that I think cause what we call the symptoms of a heart attack. And one of them is an acute clot forming, a clot that forms so rapidly there's no time for the body to build collaterals around it. Because collateral arteries do form, based on Giorgio Beraldi's work, anytime there's a 70% narrowing of an artery, the body builds collaterals around it, and it bypasses it, and it supplies the heart with blood, which is why people have heart caths all the time and they see 100% blockage and they never had a heart attack symptom, because the body builds collaterals around it. But if a clot happens too fast, instantaneously, and there's no time for collaterals to form, that can restrict blood flow to an area and cause a heart attack. However, there's a completely different mechanism of heart attacks that I think may be the most prominent one. It's not a blockage of an artery. It's not this buildup of plaque or a plaque rupture or anything like that, which there's lots of evidence against that too in the literature. But the second mechanism um, is autonomic nervous system imbalance signaling to the heart, which we just discussed comes from the heart itself and the environment that you're in. So in the heart tissue, it's supposed to have like the whole body really, but specifically important for the heart. You're supposed to have this balanced sympathetic and parasympathetic signaling to the heart. And if we get a surge in like a stress response, we get a sympathetic surge, there's always a lesser surge of parasympathetic to keep things in balance. So the way I think about it is if you're walking your dog on a leash and your dog sees your neighbor and it tries to go after your neighbor. That's the stress response. That's the sympathetic response. The leash is the parasympathetic response that's holding it, the vagal brake that keeps things in check. So the stress response is still happening, but your body's keeping it in check. Whereas if the leash wasn't there, dog gets off, goes off, attacks your neighbor, something bad happens. That's a heart attack, in my opinion, because what happens is if we get that surge in sympathetic without the lesser surge of parasympathetic, it causes this increased adrenaline-like signal to the heart tissue, and the heart's a muscle, and that signals the heart to burn more glucose than it would like to, because the heart, based on multiple studies, prefers fatty acids and ketones for fuel. And if it gets this surge in sympathetic activity, it can burn more glucose than it wants to. And if it does that, that can cause a lactic acid or hydrogen ion buildup in the tissue. Just like if you go for a run and you run and your leg muscle starts to burn, it's the same kind of thing because you're burning glycogen in your muscles. And if that happens in heart tissue, it can create a burn, which we know as angina. And then if that happens enough, and it overwhelmingly happens, then that buildup of lactic acid and hydrogen ions can create a swelling or edema in the tissue. And when the swelling happens, the pressure from the tissue is greater than the pressure of the blood coming in. And so when that pressure happens like that, now the blood can't get in, we get lack of oxygen, lack of nutrients, and we get tissue death. And that's I think why we see that heart attacks. So it all has to do with the stress response. If you have this impaired stress, like if you're incoherent, you have all these things creating incoherence, and then you get this stress response, like, which is why we see heart attacks are more prevalent on Mondays and during stressful days of the year and during daylight savings and all that stuff. It's because it changes in this incoherent state. It changes the stress response signaling to the heart, and then if that happens without the vagal brake, we get this cascade of events that causes tissue death. And Beraldi found that in his work. In tons of autopsies, he found that the heart tissue death in someone who had a heart attack was in a different place than where he found the blockage, because the heart tissue death happens because of these other mechanisms in many cases. And so that could happen. That could have happened for me. It could have been an acute blockage. I was dehydrated at the time. I convinced myself not to drink water except when I was thirsty, which was like never. And so that was unwise of me. And so I was pretty dehydrated. And then I did I did a workout. It wasn't squash. It was, I was just doing a workout. Like I was sprinting up the hill and then dropping and doing push-ups to failure and doing lunges to failure. So I created this inflammatory stress response, which in the state of that dehydration could have caused an acute clot to form. Also, I just gotten very stressful news a day and a half before the heart attack about a family member that we couldn't do anything about. We were just kind of sitting around waiting for it to resolve itself, hoping that it would. I spent the whole day, like after I heard that news, trying to figure out if I could get to this person, and I was in this state of stress. And then I did this stress producing thing, which was this hard workout. And 20 minutes later, started having these symptoms that intensified. So it could have been the whole mechanism of the imbalanced stress response too. And people were like, well, how do you know? How do you know how to live? It's just like, well, the things that would reduce a clotting response, the things we've talked about here, the infrared light, the grounding, all that stuff, increasing melatonin with circadian rhythm, all those things are also the same things that help create coherence. And so, yeah. So those are they do the same thing. They're preventing the same thing, which all makes sense because that's the natural environment and way of life for humans. And we're just removing ourselves from that by all these modern life demands that we have. So yeah, I don't know which one it was, because people like they went in and they put a stent in. And as soon as they put the stent in, well, I mean, the timeline was kind of blurred for me. I was awake the whole time, but like they put the stent in and my symptoms stopped, but they also gave me morphine like within the same timeline. So like, did it just kill my ability to feel anything, or did the morphine slow the stress response that was happening, or did the placing the stent open up the artery and restore blood flow? Like, what was it? I don't know. All I can do is the things I'm doing now and reduce the risk of that happening again.
Yeah, I think this has to be one of the most interesting podcasts I've ever been able to listen to firsthand. But I think another question, just to finish off, why do more men than women
Mhm.
have heart attacks?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I talk about that in my book a little bit. And the statistics are still now that more women or men have heart attacks than women. And historically, they thought that it was like, men had like more stressful jobs. They were the breadwinners and that kind of thing. And it has shown that women are catching up, in heart attack rates. But one of them is menstruation, is one theory, that there's this monthly cycle of more parasympathetic signaling that women get during menstruation, and that's keeping them more coherent and more balanced in the autonomic nervous system. So that's one theory. I think, oh man, I forget what else I talked about in the book. There's a few different ones. I mean, the bigger cycle though is it's not just men versus women. It's winter versus summer. There's way more heart attacks in winter, which, if you ask me, has to do with artificial light and imbalanced circadian rhythm and low melatonin and that kind of stuff. Um, but yeah, I have to go back and review that now.
It's fine because I was going to mention your book anyway. Actually, I think you have two books, don't you? Or is it just the one?
I have
Oh,
three.
sorry, I didn't realize.
Yeah, no,
Yes.
the first one is just kind of your basic paleo version of like, evolution and how we're not evolving and, we're mismatched between the evolutionary environment. The second one is understanding the heart, um, which is me trying to understand the heart and talks about a lot of the different things that we talked about today. And the third one is called Pain Sense, where it's my take on chronic pain and how to rewire the brain, and that kind of stuff, and body work therapies and different things. My aspects on and body charge and those kind of things. Yeah.
Yeah, so those books, I definitely know about two of them, and I definitely own the Heart book and I have read it. But where can people find you, and how do people reach out to you if they want a consultation?
And my website is resourceyourhealth.com. And everything's on there pretty much. My health community consulting books are on there, products I recommend, the blog that I infrequently write on is all on there. And then my social media is just Dr. Stephen Hussey, Dr. Stephen Hussey. People can reach out there, and I'm always sharing new things I find on there as well.
Because also you attend conferences as a speaker, because we'll be meeting each other for the second time in Tennessee soon. So there's also opportunities for people to meet you in person as well, and for invitations for you to speak. Because like I said, even though I did work on hearts a long time ago, you've explained and talked about, I just think it's the most interesting thing I've heard for a long time. And I just wish more information like you're spreading would get out into the wider world. And then one thing before we finish, I did want to ask, why do you think Ansel Keys did what he did with the data? And why do you think, and who is it that's stopping what you've just told us all, which makes complete sense to me, from being got out into the mainstream?
I think that at the time, and probably still today too, but like at the time, scientists were trying to make a name for themselves. And he got this idea, and he developed a study that would prove his idea, quote unquote, prove his idea, that he could, sit down. And the thing was is that heart disease was rising at the time, and for the first time in history, recorded history, I think, Eisenhower had a heart attack in the Oval Office. Like, the country was kind of freaking out about it a little bit. They was just scared. They were scared of this new disease, and so they wanted to give him an answer. And so Keys wanted to be the hero. He was a very charismatic guy, they say, and but he also, I think, got backing from the food industry and the pharmaceutical industry. Because if you convince the world that cholesterol and saturated fat is bad for you, you can convince them to eat more processed foods that are free of cholesterol, these grains and sugars and vegetable oils. And also, if you convince the world that cholesterol is bad for you and higher in the blood is bad for you, you can sell a bunch more drugs that lower cholesterol. So I don't know if it's like actually documented that he received a lot of money, but going the way things go now today, like I would be surprised if he didn't receive a lot of money from those industries to kind of help push this theory, especially after he first published his 6 country study and a 7 country study. I'm sure that people reached out to him. And so that by that point, like, that much money behind it, it just kind of takes off. The industry just kind of drives that. And then in 1984, they put the committee together to decide that cholesterol was bad based on funding by these committees and by these industries. And so that's just kind of how it's been. And since 1984, they'll say, yes, heart attacks or heart disease deaths have decreased. And they'll say, yeah, because we're taking statins and everything. It's like, no, it's because we have heart cath procedures. It's because I'm still alive today. That's why heart disease deaths have decreased, because I didn't die of a heart attack because we developed these heart cath procedures. If that was what saved my life, maybe it was the morphine. I don't know. Um, but but yeah, So that's what keeps the theory going, is the industry funding behind it. And like it goes deep. It's the industry funds the medical schools, the pharmaceutical industry and the food industries fund the continuing education for medical doctors. So they're just telling them all the information, and like the pharmaceutical reps come into the offices and they teach them about the latest research, but that's the research from the pharmaceutical industry. So unless a doctor starts to think outside the box and question things and do their own research, they're just listening to that stuff that's spoon fed to them. And so that keeps the theory going, and it keeps the industry going, more importantly, because that's what keeps the whole idea going. When in reality, it's completely different. Like what they're saying to us are completely different than what humans have experienced and eaten and everything for the entire time humans have been here. So yeah.
Yeah, because it was, I was going at whether Ansel Keys did it on purpose or by accident. And then I think back to President Eisenhower, didn't he smoke 100 cigarettes a day? So there's a big other factor in why he had a heart attack as well.
Well, not to mention he was during World War II, like
Yeah.
just previous to that. Like we'll talk about incoherence.
Yes. Yeah. Wasn't he a fighter pilot as well before being a president? I'm sure that I've read that.
Mhm.
But yeah, so that's a pretty stressful thing for Mr. Eisenhower. So anyway, I can't thank you enough for doing this podcast. I think it's been absolutely brilliant, and you've just like tied together so many different areas of cardiology into a lovely little podcast, and I'm sure people will really enjoy it. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you very much for watching. You can find links to Dr. Hussey's website and Instagram in the description. Also, consider subscribing to my Substack, where I go into more detail on many of the topics that you find on this channel. And also, I've got lots of free PDFs on different subjects from quantum biology, leptin, fasting, and that's all in the description as well.